English translation. 660-second contact. Part 1. Thursday, the 3rd of November, 2016, 9:58 hours.
Greetings, Ptaah, dear friend, and be welcomed. I am glad that you are here today after all, since Florina told me last night that you will probably not be able to come to do the revision until Saturday.
I also greet you and thank you for your welcome, Edward, dear friend. Unfortunately, I had to change my plans for Saturday because, together with Quetzal, I have other things to do that we cannot postpone. The revision work that I promised for today cannot be carried out, as you had Florina tell me.
Yes, because it turned out that the carpenter is coming this afternoon, since I have to clarify some things with him because of some damage that has to be repaired in one of the bathrooms. But may I ask you a question I would otherwise forget?
Naturally. What has now arisen with regard to the...
I would like to tell you, but I have a question before I forget it again. It's about what I asked you some time ago. From your father Svath, and then also in school, I learned to simply say and write on the other side, when referring to something else. As I had already privately told you some time ago and asked you to ask your language scholars whether on the other side might be wrong, which I am actually used to saying, but which is always corrected as wrong.
Excuse me, I forgot about that. Of course, I inquired and had it explained to me that both forms, on the other hand and on the other side, are correct, and that both are also used in the German language. I have personally checked this and established that it is indeed the case in the German and also in the Swiss German written and spoken area that both on the other hand and on the other hand are customary.
Well, yes. Good, thank you.
Then back to my question regarding the...
Bernadette and I have...
That is unpleasant, and for me, absolutely incomprehensible and even ridiculous, because...
I know, and also said it. I think that is simply out for revenge, because the self-intentional withdrawal from the Figu is regretful and not coped with, as was obviously the case with others, or still is.
That is how I see it, and what they then see as a reason to think up antagonistic lies and slander, to spread them and even to introduce false accusatory judicial measures such as, but in addition and to the constant attacks against you, the core group members and the Figu Association. I cannot avoid to speak my opinion now any more openly in relation to all adversaries who spread purposeful lying and slanderous rumors against you, the Figu members and the association. They spread infamous insinuations in the form of lies and slander, defamatory and using abusive language, as this now also does, but which was to be expected even before the withdrawal during the period of absence. But now I want to take a stand on the whole adversary being, whereby I have to say something different in detail and also repetitively. A dirty battle is waged especially in Switzerland, as in Germany and the USA in particular, but also to a lesser extent in other countries. Full of hatred against you, the association Figu, and against the truth, just as such a battle against the teaching of truth. Teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life has never taken place in a given framework, because in former times the electronic and technical possibilities for it were lacking. These, however, are given in modern times and are diligently used by antagonists, know-it-alls, public media of every kind, by sect gurus, certain theologians, journalists, journals, liars, enviers, slanderers, and boundlessly unteachable, hateful, revengeful, self-righteous, as well as certain irresponsible ex-association and family members to disparage you, the teaching, the association Figu, and its members. And that I will name these listed adversaries in what I now have to say in several ways will be inevitable, because all of them are to blame for the fact that in the last 45 years there have been 23 malicious and dangerous attacks on you. The dirty attacks, threats, manipulations, and defamations in this regard are directed in an unprecedented way mainly against the doctrine, in order to prevent the spread and to maintain and promote anew the predominance of deception in relation to terrestrial human beings for the various false religions. which have a blatant sectarianism as well as for the various sects of all kinds themselves. Of course, you as a person are also affected by this, because the attacks are, of course, openly directed against you and your personality. Your honor, dignity, and integrity in the first place, in order to make you impossible for the public through lies and slander in your senses and aspirations. Certain theologians and organizations, in particular, who deal with sectarianism and who make false assumptions as a result of false information. Hearsay and delusions of grandeur, self-exaggeration, know-it-all and slander, and deliberately spread lies in public through the media do not shy away from doing so. Demagogy is the secret weapon that always brings the most success for liars and slanderers among good believers. Because they are tired of thinking or even lazy about thinking, and can neither enable themselves nor pick themselves up to get to the bottom of a matter by self-initiative. Therefore, they gladly accept every lie and slander as truth, represent it, and become liars and slanderers themselves. Among those who spread lies and slander about the teaching and about you are also certain of your family members or alumni who, because of their hatred, dishonesty, and selfishness, feel themselves to be called by self-deception to defend their wrong way of life by lies, deceit, and slander. Therefore they, like all other adversaries, especially certain theologians and sect fighters, but also certain vengeful former family and club members, use certain public media which like to be manipulated by sensations and invent and spread even manipulating untruths. And they do this in order to have a large readership and to manipulate and mislead the mass of the readership. So in interviews with antagonistic journalists or interviewees, lies and slander are invented that are so far removed from reality and truth that the statements must already be called psychopathic lies and slander. In this way, the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life is also denigrated as a sectarian false teaching, and you are insulted as a sectarian guru by those who sympathize with lies and slander in order to annihilate yourself as a human being. And why Earth humans believe the agitating, seditious, inflammatory, provocative media is also due to their naivety, through which they do not recognize the manipulations and hypocrisy of those media that spread sensation-hungry self-invented falsehoods, or publish those of the insincere and discriminating. This has been especially so since the end of your 33-year marriage covenant, because at that time the poison cupboard of malicious propaganda of lies and slander really opened, which has not been closed again by the liars and slanderers until today, and will remain open even further. As a result, since then, and continue to escape, new poisons of shameful defamation have escaped time and again, which have been able to poison all uncontrolled thoughts and feelings of Earth humans and continue to do so, because these waves of lies and slander poisons have rolled over all untruth believers since time immemorial. And these honorary stirrings, which effectively insult, disparage, revile, and injure reality and truth, are unfortunately not recognized by the naive, untruthful believers. And they also follow the machinery of lies and slander of those public media, those theologians, sect warriors, and other adversaries of all kinds, who wage a greasy, inflammatory, and partly sneaky shadow war, as well as an open propaganda war against you and the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, interspersed with lies and slander. The very first sacrifice in all attacks shall be the truth which you teach and spread through the teaching. The truth shall be killed. And since the truth is best killed when they exchange it and reality for lies and slander, which disguise it as unassailable in truth, opponents, such as certain theologians, sect fighters, and antagonists of all kinds, set the tone, as well as former vengeful members of the association, who cannot cope with their own desired resignation from the association or your family, and can therefore not find their way. those manipulable media for their revenge campaigns, which reach out to them sensation greedily benevolently to it the hand. And in order to reach as large a naive, unneeded readership as possible and to draw attention to the campaign of lies and slander, tearful lie and slander propagandistic title pages and title announcements are made to draw attention to a sensation. In this way, the vile, false, and manipulated and perfected reporting functions, whereby this principle is maintained not only by certain theologians and sect fighters of media and organizations, but also in agreement of all adversaries. And that with that readership and audience, which is naive, this strikes like a bomb and triggers a believing effect that might be understandable even to a fool. This is in contrast to those readers and listeners who use their world of thought and do not simply believe the sensationalist cheats, swindles, and manipulations of the relevant public or private smear media, but get to the bottom of the matter. Unfortunately, according to our findings, the large mass of readers and listeners is weak, lazy, and cowardly with regard to dubious public media, which is why the level of language and the norm of reason, as well as the level of one's own ability to make decisions, can be lowered by one's own rational ideas, which greasy media and adversaries of all kinds know and use very well. So it is a fact that the greater the mass of the naive, the simple-minded, and thus also the less well-educated readership and listeners, the more outrageous lies and slander can be spread and offered as truth and repeated, because from this kind of earth no distinction of truth, lie, and slander is possible, because for them truth has no meaning. The lies and slander contents, which are repeated again and again, are only of importance for the naive and simple-minded, because the constant repetition of discrimination, slander, and defamation, untruths, pretenses, falsifications, and distortions of truth means true to them. This corresponds to a principle that can be very easily achieved through public media and the internet, and reaches a barely visible mass of terrestrial people. By blogging, twittering, and commenting, whole seas of infamous agitation, lies, and slander are flooding all over the world, using everything to unfairly manipulate the masses. The fact is that a very large part of humanity on Earth can be so strongly influenced by untruths as a result of naivety and lack of neediness that, as a result of the media doctrinations as well as lies and slander put forward by him, he cannot think or make his own decision. And since those corrupt and manipulative media, whom are the determining force behind their mischief with untruth, are popular and believed by the simple-minded and naive people, it is clear to the naive media believers that everything must be as these media report. So the principle is simple. The media, the very manipulative and lying ones that are addressed, determine what is to be considered true, and because that is so, they also control the opinion of the masses of the readership. It is probably just as clear that the fear of the readership also plays a role in this as it is that the false, lying and defamatory reports of the guilty corrupt media are associated with horrendous financial gains. Also in the pockets of those unjust journalists and media makers who do not care about the truth, horrendous sums flow, as well as if possible in the pockets of those who reveal their lying stories. The fact is that all antagonists use all sorts of media against the effective reality and truth that reach out to them for lies and slander. Especially certain theologians and sect fighters find many possibilities to insult religious and sect-independent communities as sects and their leaders against all reality and truth as sect gurus. And these theological and sect-fighting elements, as well as media-linked elements, who perfidiously burden innocent Earth humans, groups and associations with false accusations, know very well how they can reach the faithful, the naive, and the simple-minded from the mass of readers and listeners and deceive them with falsehoods and bring them to their side. They are perfect in their profession of persuasion and know how to present their lies and slander, so that it may be accepted as truth by the masses of the naive, the good faith and the simple-minded, and that lower instincts of contempt and rage, etc., may be awakened in them against those who are humiliated, insulted, and blasphemed in a discriminatory and misleading manner of injustice. The guilty, the schemers and discriminators, the agitators and the certain theologians, sect warriors and all sorts of adversaries who spread the untruth. Play with it by warning the readers and listeners and falsely claiming that if they, the liars and slanderers who are them, are not given faith, then the believers will perish. And if they also repeat this lie only often enough, then sooner or later it will be believed by the followers and believers. This faith then also inevitably leads to the fact that in the faithful of certain theologians, antagonists of every kind, former members of associations or families, the fear increases and quickly becomes worse and turns into hatred against all those who are insulted and discriminated against with lies and slander. If naive and uninformed Earth humans are influenced by discrimination, duping, blinding, distorting the truth and falsifying the truth, etc., this will cause lasting fear and hatred in them, for they will be struck by it as by a viciously striking, powerful and hard fist from which they cannot escape. The fact is that hatred is always rooted in fear, and it follows that when hatred is directed against fellow human beings, groups or associations, etc., it is directed against them. Lies and slander in unstable. Naive and simple-minded earthlings who accept defamations and fairy tales of lies as truth, who first and foremost have a shock effect and who fall into a state of incomprehension. But then there is a rejection and dissatisfaction, which leads to anger and, on the other hand, even to rage, but ultimately to fear because it is believed that what is discredited, defamed, insinuated, and underestimated in a dishonest way can result in personal, religious, or community damage. And this fear is then lifted up and develops into hatred, which becomes powerful and quickly extreme, whereby the person concerned very quickly changes negatively and becomes the willing tool of the liars and slanderers, who act as malicious adversaries more and more often in intriguing, lying, and slanderous, and are proud of it. And proud are also the naive and simple-minded, the believers of psychopathic adversaries, when they work imitatively in the same way and can possibly cause damage against those who are slandered by lies. The lying and slanderous adversaries have a fine sense for the fears of the naive and simple-minded and believing people on earth, and consequently they know very well that they can manipulate them in the worst way by their lies and slander. And they do and can do this because the believers are struck in their lower instincts, and they thereby bring their thoughts, feelings, psyche and consciousness into turmoil, and are no longer able to control their budding aversion and hatred against those fellow human beings. Affairs, incidents, events, groupings, circumstances, objects, figures, facts, and associations, etc., that are discredited by them, the irresponsible adversaries by lies and slander. False accusations are therefore very incriminating for the influenced and deceived believers. But this does not concern the adversaries because they think only of themselves, but in no way of the misled fellow human beings who drive them into misery and distress through the fear and hatred built up in them. And this sneaky system of the believer indoctrination of certain theologians, sect fighters, media, and bad newspaper scribblers, as well as adversaries of all kinds, functions today by the media and the internet so well and perfectly as it was otherwise never possible since time immemorial, because the necessary worldwide technical information possibilities were never given before. The liars and slanderers must present to their misguided, naive, and simple-minded believers only a suitable scapegoat by falsehood, insult, humiliation, defamation, disparagement, mockery, by injury, slander, exposing, offending. blaspheming, rebuking, disqualifying, degrading, and reviling, in order to bring them to their side and to make them act and howl against the insulted in their sense in a disadvantageous manner. By this, the faithful who have fallen in love with them become accomplices, who may also be willing to use G-Vault against the innocently slandered or otherwise do harm. And if they do this and have begun to do so once, then nothing will be questioned anymore, but everything will be done again. And the greater the number of the naive and the simple-minded who believe their adversaries and reach out their hands, the greater their interest becomes in keeping up the lies and slander, in continuing them, in multiplying and spreading them. The adversaries of all kinds make lying allegations, invent false suspicions, spread offensive lies and slander, and thereby bring righteous fellow men, groups or associations, etc. into disrepute. And they do this by insulting their victims of unfairness, sectarianism and exploitation, etc., as it is done against you, the doctrine and the association figu by certain theologians, public media, sect fighters, self-righteous newspaper writers, even former members who left the association, vengeful former members, as well as fallen family members. It is a fact in everything that the always new attacks with regard to the spreading of lies and slander of the antagonists of all kinds correspond to an ongoing provocation to induce you and the association figu to take action against the discriminations, etc., through jurisdiction. Because there is the deceitful hope connected with it, that you, the association and its members, would then be made ridiculous by the media and judged as insane. Therefore, and also because, for example, certain theologians are megalomaniacs and autocrats and furthermore want to save their religion, which has to register strongly sinking membership numbers, on this side lies slander and insults against you, and the association figu are operated. And that naturally unjust adversaries of all kinds, as well as the naive and the simple-minded, who are not capable of their own rational thinking and therefore also not capable of their own rational decisions, join them, which is absolutely unavoidable. This means for the unscrupulous antagonists that their ideology of lies and slander becomes a power game for them, which they savor and in doing so value themselves highly. And the more the feeling of power is raised in them, the more they invent discriminatory lies, slander and abuse, and sow doubt to destroy the effective truth. The whole thing is based on a propaganda of lies and slander that uses all public media and the internet as a weapon, in the form of a basic principle based on a discriminatory struggle for lies and slander that is given in this way. What must not be cannot and must not be. With such stupid words you shall be destabilized in your work as well as the doctrine, the association figu, but also all members in the same way, who shall be led into abysmal doubts. Your and the members as well as the association figu openness to the world, openness and tolerance, your all humane behavior, your honesty, your integrity, your equality of all human beings on earth, as well as the fact that you yourselves face your enemies peacefully and do not bring anything evil or negative towards them, is denigrated by the antagonists and insulted as hypocrisy. But they are in fear because they can lose their misguided followers, believers, and sympathizers. So the adversaries manipulate by lies, deception, and slander all those who are or become in bondage to them. All adversaries of any kind, as well as their naive and unneeded followers, are very afraid that the members of the figu association will be able to fulfill their desire, namely to achieve their defined goal and the results as shown by the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. And these results, the goal and the striving for it, are based on interpersonal and outer peace, on inner and outer freedom and harmony, like everything, but especially also on a self-centered happiness and contentment, like outside also on a world peace is aligned. These are the basic values of the Figu members, who build on and tend towards a righteous life and irreproachable behavior in every respect. These abilities, which Figu members are motivated to strive for, also promote their will building and volition or strength of will up to the implementation of the will and the achievement of the desired results. In addition to a strong will, overcoming obstacles, distractions, and problems on the way to the goal, the consequent ability of self-decision, self-management, and planning one's own plans for what is to be achieved as the goal also belong. Self-control and the right action in every relationship and all the high values that are aspired to, however, require constant and lifelong learning, finding the truth in oneself, using the whole and implementing it in life in the right way. This, however, requires a great deal of thought work, searching and recognizing as well as commitment, energy and strength, completely against all religious and sectarian beliefs, which correspond no more and no less than to an effortless, meaningless, and purposeless consumption of dogmas and imagined fantastic fairy tales. Every Figu member, whether a core group member or a passive member, is thus voluntarily required to learn and study the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life on his own initiative and without compulsion, and to strive for and become what he wants to be according to his own discretion and ability, according to his own guidelines and abilities. The willpower of the Figu members must therefore be their key ability to cultivate responsible action and action, self-discipline, irreproachability, consistency, a healthy world of thoughts and feelings as well as a carefree psyche, as well as especially controlled focusing in order to remain happy, satisfied and unswerving on the course of self-development with regard to the evolution of one's own consciousness until the highest possible result is achieved at the end of life.
Nice long speech, dear friend, but what you have done really hits the nail on the head. There is probably nothing more to be said. So I think I can ask you how you judge my answer to Akim Wolf's question, in which I also inserted the excerpt from the conversation between your father Svath and me, which you transmitted to me. I gave the whole thing to Florina for you as usual, as well as the article I wrote so that you could read everything in peace.
As usual, everything is presented in the right way, both in terms of the reader's response and the long article. So there's nothing to complain about or correct. And I also want to say that it is good if you have Florina or Anjana send me such writing so that I can read them before I come here. In this way, it can be avoided that we have to shorten our conversations if I had to read everything first, especially when it is as much as this time.
That's what we agreed, and I will stick to that, of course.
It just needs to be mentioned again.
I see what you mean. Then I will probably insert the reader's question-answer and the article at this point. Or what do you think?
You can do it any way you want.
Well, then I will first insert the reader's questions and their answers here.
Reader questions by Akim Wolf and the Figu Süddeutsche Studiengruppe of the 14th of May 2016. Question: Did the primordial cell Luca already contain the determination of incarnation, page 245, Lehrschrift? The whole purpose of life is to be able to make a contribution to the evolution of creation, which, however, is only possible for the human form of life. Thus, the countless species of plants and animals are to be understood as interdependent stations on the branches and branches of the evolution tree. The design of the individual life forms should be understood as the result of an adaptation to the constantly changing environmental conditions on a physical, biological, and sociological level on the developing planet Earth. In the last consequence in the evolution chain flora with an impulse consciousness, an additional evolution consciousness developed finally according to regulations, a life form. With his abilities for understanding and reason, which define this form of life as a human being, it has asserted itself as the dominant earthly form of life. If Earth's environmental conditions for the evolutionary chain had been different, could a life form in water, for example, have developed an evolutionary consciousness and thus become a non-humanoid human being?
Answer. Each primordial cell corresponds to a second generation, which is derived from a first generation, which the Pleiadians call the primordial cell, but which is not capable of creating effective life, as it is to be understood as such. Only the second generation, that is to say the primordial cell, which today is called Luca by earthly biological science, is capable and able to develop life, as it is understood in the biological sense, according to Pleiadian explanations. The very first primordial cell was formed before the later originated and life-giving primordial cell, or Luca, whereby this primordial cell consisted of the first precursors of microorganisms formed from amino acids, which according to Pleiadian explanation were only the first underdeveloped, but not yet life-giving primordial microorganism forms. However, these early forms of pre-microorganisms developed further and formed into primordial cells, which expanded and multiplied in self-replication, from which the effective first microorganism life, according to human understanding, emerged. All beginnings in this way, however, were absolutely neutral form, consequently no programming, etc., was present in the primordial cell, through which certain life forms, such as humans, animals, getaways, etc., would have emerged. Such programs only emerged in the course of many billions of years, when the first higher forms of life in the sense of self-sufficient, independent and multifarious genera and species already existed, and a fauna and diverse flora had emerged. The fauna and thus all these individuals, creatures, beings, creatures and organisms developed inexorably and changed over the course of millions of years, as did the vegetation, which formed a cover of vegetation and caused vegetation that many living beings could feed on. All these fauna and flora were classified and developed since the beginning of all life natural evolution processes and changed over millions of years into various other forms, genera and species. From one of these primeval life forms, a development took place up to the human being, and to human-like forms see following list human species, with conscious further development of consciousness. From one of these early forms of life, from which the early or prehistoric man finally emerged, through further evolutionary changes and developments during the last 47 million years. A fossil from the Tertiary Eocene period was found in the Messel mine near Darmstadt. It was the fossil of a creature called IDA by paleontologists and described as a small semi-monkey. In the 1940s, however, Svarth declared that it was not a monkey creature, but an archetype of very early human development, which could then be described with a clear conscience as a very early archetypal form, namely as Homo ascensus primitivus, so to speak, which I take the liberty of describing as primitive ascension man or primitive climbing man. Svarth explained that at the time of the existence of the IDA being, it was the time at which this creature developed in the earliest sequence, in such a way that in the course of millions of years, it had to develop into the human species. At the same time, there were other and similar and partly related living beings besides this IDA being, which are called semi-monkeys by earthly paleontological scientists. Paleontology equals sign teaching of the old being. Also, these different types developed themselves further. Consequently, from it, on the one hand, the type of the actual big and small monkey beings and all their types resulted, like also the so-called apes, the chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orang-utans, who stand, however, neither in any connection with the human being nor its early origin. Thus, the genus primates, that is to say humans, came out, contrary to all false scientific claims, already started with Darwin from an absolutely own development process of a very own life-form line, which furthermore in no way led back to any semi-monkey or monkey lines. In this regard, however, since Darwin, a slander of origin is unfortunately practiced with regard to humans, which will continue far into the future, as can also be seen from the following partly very erroneous representation in Wikipedia. Primates are an order belonging to the superorder of Euarchontoglires within the subclass of the higher mammals. Their exploration is the subject of primatology. The term monkeys is sometimes used for this order, but is misleading because monkeys are only a subgroup. Primates are divided into the two suborders of the wet-nosed primates Strepsirrhini and dry-nosed primates Haplorhini, the latter also including the great apes Hominidae, including humans Homo sapiens. The name comes from the Latin primus, the first, and refers to man as the crown of creation. The Pleiadian, like the universal primordial prophet Nocodemion, in his storage banks, explained that the genus man alone is to be named and regarded as primate lat. Primus, the first one who stands in the first place and is something of precedence, and that this is applicable to him alone, while every kind of monkey being are real monkeys, who are in no way related to man, neither from the ground up nor today. In the whole universe, man takes an absolute primate position among all living beings and has in no way anything in common with master animals, etc., as for example the so-called apes are called, and in Latin erroneously called Hominidae. According to Nocodemion and the Pleiadian, the human species corresponds from the ground up to an absolutely unique development, which originated about 50 million years ago from a primordial animal form, and from which biological human development developed. This is in contrast to other similar primitive animal forms, from which all ape creatures have developed, while from the human lineage different races have developed, as these were called in the 469th Contact Conversation of the 11th of August, 2008 in relation to 18 races by the Pleiadian in the following manner. 1. Humanoids are human beings in the form in which we Pleiadian and Earthlings are, as well as many of our allies in our Federation, but which also include other forms of life that cannot be called humanoids in our sense, because they are of a completely different kind, but nevertheless consciously capable of evolution, and have developed their own cultures, techniques, and languages, as I have already explained. 2. Amphiboids are in the form of life forms of mixed human and water animal-like nature, which can live both in the water and on land, as well as in a climate that is strongly water-impregnated. Asana, for example, and her people are part of it. 3. Reptiloids are forms of mixed human and reptilian forms of life in which their body is covered with scales. 4. Insectoids are forms of mixed human and insect-like life forms in shape, their skin showing chitin-like peculiarities. 5. Sauroides are life forms of mixed human and sauropod-like form, with a skin that resembles the elephant skin at shape. 6. Primatoids are life forms of mixed human and primate similar form, with hairy body at shape, however in stronger kind than the terrestrial humanoid, that is to say, terrestrial human being. 7. Condycoids are humanoids in form of life forms, but with the ability to move through levitation. 8. Pteropoids are at shape life forms with human and bird-good body, with long neck, face, and beak similar mouth. 9. Hydroids are forms of life with human and fish-like bodies, whose actual life element is water, but which they can also leave for a longer time. 10. Thermoids are humanoid life forms with human-like bodies, whose own life element are hot regions with very high temperatures. 11. Frigoroids are humanoid life forms with human body at shape, whose life element is very cold areas with very low minus temperatures. 12. Aeroids are humanoid life forms with human body in shape, whereby they are poison gas breathers and their life element diverse gas atmospheres. 13. Acaroids are humanoid forms of life with a human body, but their skin is covered by a fine layer of acid, such as the trilans. 14. Fluoroids are in shape life forms with human-like and diverse vegetable bodies. 15. Kentoroides are life forms with partly human and partly horse-like body. 16. Faunoids are life forms with partly human and partly diverse hoofed moderate bodies. 17. Cheruboids are very light human life forms at shape and weight, provided with feathered wings through which they can fly. 18. Seraphoids are very easy life forms at shape and weight, with partly human and partly diverse animal body, provided with feathered wings through which they can fly.
Question: is the above brief description of human evolution correct?
Answer: that can be said yes.
Question: are all terrestrial biological life forms actually the result of a single common cell type, a primordial cell, which in science is called LUCA last universal common ancestor?
Answer: this is only true to the extent that a single primordial cell was created first, which, however, enabled itself to multiply itself. The detailed relationship is set out below as a detailed reply.
Question: every life form possesses a spirit form, which incarnated for the first time as a new spirit form in this time. What determines whether a new spirit form incarnates into a certain life form, or whether a spirit form reincarnates into a certain life form?
Answer: there is no determination that a spirit form incarnates into a certain life form, but only a determination into which genus/species a spirit form reincarnates. The facts of the matter are this: around every planet and throughout the universe exists the creative spirit energetic mass from which every tiny spirit form for every material form of life emerges. The spirit form by which individuals are enlivened forms itself from the ground up, according to the corresponding life forms when it enters or is born into a form of life as only a tiny new spirit form, or as a neutral positive, tiny spirit-forming mass. The entire great mass of the spirit form, which encompasses all planets and world space objects and the entire universe, exists in its own universe-wide spirit energetic sphere, but is absolutely neutral pulsing and ineffective in its original state. In this form, the entire mass of spirit form lies fallow and has never been bound to any form of life. A binding of a clusters of spirit forms to an indefinite form of life only arises when a tiny separation of the spirit from the entire neutral planetary and universal mass of spiritual energy takes place. Thus, a tiny fragment of spiritual energy separation from the entire planetary, that is to say, universal spiritual form energy, is created and forms a new spirit form. If a new life form of any genus or species has to be committed by a new spirit form. If this is the case, then the new spirit form, which has never before incarnated or reincarnated, gives birth as neutral spirit form energy/spirit form agglomeration into the new material life form, which can belong to any genus or species. The tiny fragment agglomeration of new spirits is invisible, and when it is first incarnated in the brain of an individual, regardless of genus or species, it immediately harmonizes itself harmoniously with the form of life concerned and programs itself, so to speak, on the individual concerned. This, when a neutral spirit energetic mass, which is a tiny fragment, is first born or incarnated into a human being as a new spirit form. Then it determines itself impulsively as a human spirit form and remains so for all time. If, on the other hand, a neutral new spirit form moves into another life form of another genus or species, such as an animal, reptile, bird, or fish, then it programs itself on it and thus becomes the spirit form of an animal, reptile, bird, or fish. So the new spirit form adapts itself to the first individual form that enlivens it, only to reincarnate itself into a similar individual form again and again after each passing of the corresponding life form. The new spirit form, which through the first incarnation has impulsively begun to evolutionize in the individual, is thus from now on assigned to the same individual line and reincarnates only in this line. Every neutral new spirit form that incarnates for the first time in the brain of an individual is therefore absolutely neutral in every form. Follows this also neither male nor female, but absolutely specific to a certain life form and individuality and its continuous lifeline. Only then, however, when the spirit form moves into the brain of an individual and animates it, in humans in the roof of the midbrain =sign paired node =sign colliculus superior, because a living brain requires this, does the human spirit form develop into the correspondingly necessary form. And so in man the spirit form is called the human spirit form, in other life forms accordingly the animal android, or any other necessary, and according to the individual-oriented spirit form. Only through the first entry of the tiny fragment, new spirit form or spirit form energy, into the brain of an individual does it develop into the life form and the spirit form belonging to it and named after its species.
Question: is a planetary moon a mandatory prerequisite for the formation of life on a planet?
Answer: no, because life in the form of microorganisms can also arise on suitable planets, etc., which do not have their own moons. As far as planets and moons are concerned, according to the Pleiaren, even without moons, higher life can develop on moons themselves as well as on planets, and can also carry this, even if they correspond to dark moons or dark planets without light. For this it is, however, necessary that all appropriate possibilities for the life existence of the life forms must be present, whereby these conditions are naturally completely different nature than this is the case with light-illuminated planets and moons. Detailed answer to question 3. In professional circles, the original cell is now called LUCA, which in English means last universal common ancestor, and translated means last common ancestor. This biological term, LUCA =sign the shining, was not yet known to me in 1945. Why, however, in the childish English language, last or last is said, although LUCA was the very first ancestor out of which man finally developed. This is not comprehensible, but understandable, if one considers how primitive this language, among others, is compared to German and Swiss German. I will answer the question with a short explanation, which leads back to a conversation with Svath and myself, which we brought together in 1945, and whose original recording is in the custody of the Pleiaren, of which Ptaah could now, unfortunately only after several months, get me a transmission for publication, in the form of copies made by Svath. According to his instructions, I sent the record of the short conversation to 11 astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology scientists named by him, but never received a response. This was also the case with other letters that I sent to radio stations, governments, newspapers, etc., referring to warnings about the catastrophically increasing and exuberant overpopulation that will lead to the inexorable destruction of nature and the extinction of fauna and flora. A fact that has been increasingly revealed since then in the decades to the present day, and which today has reached a level of extinction of living beings and destruction of nature, poisoning and pollution of all seas and inland waters, land masses and forests that can no longer be reversed. Since the end of the last World War in 1945, about 60% of all land, water and air creatures in Europe have already been exterminated in only about 70 years, which is without doubt and absolutely solely attributed to the effects and destructive machinations of all kinds of overpopulation. This, however, is denied by blue-eyed, know-it-all, indifferent and corrupt researchers and scientists who are horrendously paid by chemical, food and all sorts of other corporations to spread lies about the overall condition of planet Earth, its nature and fauna and flora, atmosphere and climate, etc. It is also a fact that many know-it-alls, lecturers, researchers, liars, naturalists, politicians, professors, fact twists, environmental engineers and scientists, etc., who deal with nature, life, fauna, flora, climate and weather, the seas and inland waters, land and forest, in the public, in all media possible to mankind, in all the truth, far from the hair-pulled, idiotic nonsense dispense. And these assertions are being made in a catastrophically stupid way in public, on television and radio, in journals and newspapers, as well as in speeches and lectures, which are presented to the population by experts in a disgustingly grandiose, exaggerated and pretentious manner. In the process, experts will also make pathological heiress proposals on how to counteract all factors that destroy nature: fauna, flora, atmosphere, land, forest, climate, sea and water, as well as the depletion of resources on and in Earth in a useful way. The clous et marteau in this respect are probably the ultimate in idiocy, when, with regard to the dying in nature and its forms of life that has persisted for years. On the 28th of October 2016, on Swiss television SRF 1, an expert emphasized that this catastrophe could only be countered, contained and brought to a standstill if all consumer goods were drastically increased in price. There is probably no more foolish way, and that no iota was said about the rampant overpopulation and the resulting catastrophe of the 60% extermination of the animal, fish and bird world in the last 70 years, whereby the simultaneous extermination of many plants and plants was also not mentioned, which proves how short-sighted and dull thinking many people on Earth, and especially certain experts, are, and how far they go alongside the truth. But now the conversation with Svath from the year 1945, contact conversation on Sunday, the 28th of July, 1945.
What would interest me would be something concerning how the emergence of life in the first origin has actually emerged from a scientific, chemical, biological, and physical point of view. Also, how the oxygen and the water were formed on Earth or came here. Teacher Graf unfortunately could not give me an answer to that, so I would like to ask you for an answer. Maybe it adds a lot more than I actually expect.
I know that your teacher could not teach you that, but I would like to take up this topic myself and explain to you how I think it is necessary and how you understand everything correctly. I do not doubt your ability to understand, but it may be that certain things cause you difficulty in understanding, which is why I also want to say that you interrupt me in my explanations and ask me for an interpretation if you do not understand something.
Yes.
Good. Then I will start with all very first primeval living beings or primeval microorganisms of every animate planet, as well as asteroids, comets, moon and meteors, etc., and logically also all large and gigantic life forms of every genus and species resulting from the basic primeval microorganisms originated from the first common primeval cell, which had developed from a preceding single primeval microcell in the form of an amino acid originated primeval microorganism. This contained all central molecules of life, which are also maintained at all times, whereby the chemical reactions and the genetic code are the same in all kinds of life forms. However, how life came about in principle corresponds to a central question, which can only be answered by the fact that everything in its origin resulted from pure natural biological chemical processes. Plausible answers to this question, which is important for people on Earth with regard to their conception of themselves and their worldview, have been sought in recent centuries by the natural scientists in particular, and have solved this mystery in its origin. However, no well-known findings concerning the origin of life have been gained to date, and consequently, no plausible explanation has yet been provided for this. What has brought explanations, on the other hand, refers to the theory of the evolution of biological tribal history from lower to higher forms of life, as Charles Darwin, in his simple, elegant, and 600 times confirmed theory of evolution, is known to have brought. The reality explains, however, that today's diversity of living beings on Earth has developed in its origin through primordial microorganisms, which came to Earth through impacts of asteroids and comets and meteorites, as well as through gases and dust clouds drifting through space, which also reached the planet. In the same way, this is to be seen with regard to the first quantities of water, which were brought to Earth by impacts of water-bearing asteroids from the outer areas of the asteroid belt, as well as trans-Neptunic objects in the form of comets and meteors, which fell to Earth as meteorites, as well as by chemical elements, oxygen atoms, and hydrogen atoms. From this water, which is formed from 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom each, was formed in different ways on Earth. However, a part of Earth's water has also originated on Earth itself, namely through condensation, which has originated through the outgassing of the magma from the hot interior of Earth, and continues to originate, but in a much lesser way. Now back to the primordial cell. So all life developed from a first primordial cell that multiplied itself. The offspring then developed further through repetitive, small evolutionary processes of change, in which those forms survived that best adapted to their environment and food, and were able to live and reproduce. Even today, however, it is not yet known or clear to Earth scientists that a primordial cell created all life in its very first origin, and that this originated from a single cell that multiplied infinitely. And what I am explaining to you today in this regard, you will have to remain silent for the next 6 decades, because this knowledge must first be acquired by Earth humans. But you are nevertheless to send my remarks in secrecy to the following 11 persons, whose address I will give you just as much as the corresponding copies of our conversation. So, how this primordial cell was created corresponded to a purely chemical, pre-biological development process. It was only through the development and existence of acidic substances that compounds arose, from which the first primordial microorganisms developed, which were transformed into primordial microorganisms through further combining and further training chemical or biological processes, from which a first microprimordial cell was formed, with the property of a first form of self-replication. But before the people of Earth can now discuss the origin of life, which they have been trying to do for centuries and even since antiquity, but have not yet been able to form a rhyme for it, they must learn to define what has to be understood as life at all. Living matter, for example, trees, bacteria, animals, or humans, differs from abiotic matter, for example, minerals, water, and air, in that it can replicate itself. This requires, firstly, an information storage system, or genome, and secondly, a metabolism, a biological chemical upset or metabolism. This means that this minimal unit of life with which it exchanges substances is separated from its surroundings, which in all forms of life is done by a biomembrane that serves as a separating layer between different areas within a living cell, or between the interior of a cell and the outer space of the cell. This is where amino acids come into play, because without amino acids there would be no life, because they are the basis of all life, not only on Earth, but in the whole universe and in all its many dimensions. The many prebiotic chemical reactions in the urn fossil have led to universe-wide biological life. How the amino acids first came into being is fundamentally based on the fact that gases and substances such as ammonia, methane, water, hydrogen, and other tiny molecules were formed in the universe's nebula, and above all, on universe objects or planets. In the interaction of atoms, electricity, that is to say, electric flashes, and a substance, which we call formality, as well as form solution, the first proto-amino acid, that is to say, a precursor form of amino acids, was formed. The formality or form solution is not only continuously formed under the influence of electric fields, but it is this substance which also favors and causes the formation of more complex organic molecules. And this substance is present everywhere in the universe, so also outside Earth, which means that amino acids are of absolutely natural origin and are not created by humans. From this, the development process continued and will continue endlessly, because electric fields adhere to the surface of minerals for all times of the existence of the universe, which are an important component in amino acid formation and which can continue to act endlessly. Amino acids were and are the absolute primordial cause and decisive for the beginning of life, because they form the important building blocks, proteins, which are indispensable for life. Proteins are therefore also the essential components of all cells in all forms of life, including protozoa, animals, plants, and humans. Finally, I want to say the following, because I think you are interested in knowing that the sciences can get to knowledge through theories, by extracting knowledge from them through experiments, research and investigation, etc., gain insights. Natural science in particular examines the fundamental phenomena in nature in order to explain their properties and behavior by means of quantitative models and laws. In this way, she is particularly concerned with energy and matter, as well as their interactions in space and time. What is understood in the natural science as explaining, however, does not actually mean researching the effective origin of all existence, all the research is carried out on it, because the main field of research consists of classifying and comparing all phenomena, as well as of assigning them to the right forms and of deducing or drawing conclusions from generally known and valid laws of nature. To this end, it is often necessary to think of suitable new terms in order to describe new findings, including those that are no longer directly accessible. All this applies only to pure natural science, but not to physics, which cannot afford such explanations in the philosophical sense, such as why nature behaves in this way and not differently. If physics and its mode of operation are considered, then this consists of an interplay of experimental methods and theoretical modeling. It is a fact that physical theories prove their worth in the application to systems of nature, namely by permitting predictions as accurate as possible with knowledge of the initial states, as well as states appearing later. Progressive insights are gained through the interplay of observation, experiment, and theory. If a new or further developed theory emerges, already known results can be explained better, or even for the first time. Furthermore, the results obtained can lead to new observations and experiments, from which, of course, new results emerge, which can confirm a theory or make it appear wrong. The fact is that in the natural sciences, biology, and physics, unexpected results from observations or experiments give rise to the development of theories in various ways. This can be done step by step, but it can also lead to the absolute abandonment of a theory that has been accepted for a long time. Advances in knowledge, for example, extension or limitation of the scope, can lead to a theory, but also to more precise descriptions and simplifications of these theories, as well as to new or facilitating practical applications. It should also be noted that findings and models from physics and biology, chemistry, geology, and medicine, as well as many engineering sciences, can be used intensively in certain fields of the social sciences and economics. And that is for now everything I had to say, execute, and explain to you regarding your questions.
Thank you, Svath. And I understood everything without any problems, because you have a way to call things by their name in a detailed way that is extremely remarkable for me, and which I also want to learn and appropriate.
You have been working on this for years, just as I teach you, which means that your manner of speaking and pronunciation, both spoken and written, is already above average today, which is why your teacher Carl Graf, together with the doctor and psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, often talks about your questions when they meet in Kuznacht or in Zurich, and explicitly only because of you.
Yes, I know on one occasion I recently met Mr. Young at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich when he was visiting or picking up someone there. I met him not far from the Bergholzli when I was visiting my severely handicapped sister Verena in the Matilda Escher Heim, together with my mother, as you know.
Thank you very much for the transmission of the conversation between Svath and me. But I still have a question. Namely, what is the substance called formality, or form solution by your father Svath in the actual sense, and whether our earthly scientists also know it? Unfortunately, at that time, Svath did not explain to me what is actually meant by this substance, and whether it is also discovered on Earth by the scientists.
It is actually known, and has been known for quite some time. Because the formality, or form solution, is a composition of the so-called formamides, as they are called by an earthly technical term, but it concerns a certain group of formamides.
Thank you. Then the question. As I know, the systematic classification of living beings depends on their relationship. All living beings are judged according to this classification. And since you are very well versed in various earthly sciences, including biology, I am sure you can tell me a lot about it, can't you?
That is right, I can. The main classifications of life are called domains in earthly biology, which corresponds to a systematic division or classification, as you have said. These classifications refer to three of them, namely archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes. However, the term bacteria, Latin bacteria, is considered obsolete and has been replaced by eubacteria, which are divided into strains or phyla. Also, the archaea, Latin archaea, were renamed, namely as archibacteria, whereby also these are subdivided into phyla, that is to say, tribes. The classification of the eukaryotes, Latin eukaryota, is divided into empires or regna. To the best of my knowledge, this systematic subdivision was therefore made in order to differentiate between the different structures of the so-called ribosomal ribonucleic acid. Bacteria, that is to say, eubacteria, and archaea, that is to say, archibacteria, differ in the composition of their cell membrane as well as in the biochemistry of their metabolism. The eukaryotes, on the other hand, differ in the nucleus of their cells and therefore differ from the other two classifications. Furthermore, it should be said that eukarya or eukarya is also commonly used for the classification of eukaryota. And finally, it has to be said that according to the cell structure, all living beings can be divided into two groups. On the one hand, into living beings without a cell nucleus, that is to say, the bacteria, that is to say, eubacteria, and the archaea, that is to say, archibacteria, which are called prokaryotes in this way. On the other hand, these are in contrast to living beings whose cells have a nucleus and are called eukaryotes. This classification, however, does not constitute a taxonomic classification in relation to a related system of life forms, neither on Earth nor on other planets or other world space objects.
Thank you for your execution and explanation, which actually said everything I wanted to know. But I still have a question that refers to what I wrote in the reader's question as the following answer. In the 1940s, however, Svath declared that it was not a monkey creature, but an archetype of very early human development, which could then be described with a clear conscience as a very early pre-human, namely as Homo ascensus primitivus, as it were, which I take the liberty of translating into German as primitive ascension man or primitive climbing man. What do you think, how I express what your father Svath said in a Germanizing way?
In my opinion, it applies to how you translated my father's statement into German.